Power rarely appears most vulnerable when it is surrounded by enemies. More often, its greatest vulnerability emerges when it becomes increasingly unable to recognize information that challenges its own assumptions. Institutions are built to create order, to transform uncertainty into decisions, and to give governments the confidence to act. Yet the same structures that preserve authority can also make contradiction difficult to accept. Reports that conflict with established expectations are questioned. Warnings that demand uncomfortable adjustments are delayed. Officials continue issuing directives, collecting taxes, and enforcing policy while believing that stability still exists because the machinery of government continues to move. History repeatedly reveals moments when authority remained fully operational, even as its understanding of reality became steadily narrower. The question is not why institutions gather information. It is why, under growing pressure, they often resist the very information that could allow them to adapt before their choices become more limited. Few governments illustrate this tension more clearly than the imperial administration of Qing China during the 19th century. For generations, the Qing bureaucracy governed an immense empire through an elaborate network of provincial officials, examination-trained administrators, memorial systems, and direct communication with the imperial court. Reports moved upward through carefully regulated channels before reaching the emperor, while imperial decrees flowed downward through the same administrative structure. The system emphasized consistency, hierarchy, and disciplined procedure. Provincial governors were expected to preserve order, maintain revenue, and demonstrate competence without creating unnecessary alarm. At court, senior ministers filtered information before recommendations reached the throne. The administrative machinery remained extensive and remarkably capable. Even as population growth, foreign commercial pressure, internal corruption, and regional unrest steadily increased the demands placed upon it. Authority still appeared complete. Yet the burden of interpreting reality was becoming more difficult than the burden of governing itself. The difficulty did not begin with ignorance. Officials collected enormous quantities of information. Local magistrates documented harvests, taxation, crime, and disputes. Provincial governors submitted detailed memorials describing conditions across the empire. Military commanders reported disturbances. Diplomats observed foreign developments. The challenge emerged when new information conflicted with assumptions that had long supported administrative confidence. Contradictory reports required more than acknowledgement. They demanded revisions to policies that had already become symbols of competent rule. Within such a hierarchy, disagreement carried administrative risk. An official who reported worsening conditions could appear incapable of maintaining order within his jurisdiction. Another who warned that existing policies no longer matched reality risked suggesting that earlier decisions had been mistaken. As reports advanced through successive layers of review, uncertainty often became moderated into language that appeared more manageable. Problems were not necessarily concealed outright. They were reframed until they fit established expectations. Regional officials sometimes delayed decisive action, while local merchants adjusted prices and transportation routes without knowing whether imperial directives would soon change again. The institution therefore remained informed without becoming fully persuaded. Information traveled upward, but its meaning changed as it approached the center of authority. Every administrative layer sought to preserve both accuracy and stability, yet preserving stability often took precedence whenever the two appeared to conflict. Contradiction gradually became something to be managed rather than explored. Foreign pressure intensified this pattern. Expanding commercial demands and growing diplomatic encounters introduced realities that did not fit long-standing assumptions about imperial relationships with the outside world. Reports describing unfamiliar military capabilities or changing patterns of international power challenged frameworks that had guided governance for generations. Accepting these reports fully would have required reconsidering policies that symbolized imperial legitimacy. Resistance, therefore, became less about denying isolated facts than about protecting the coherence of the governing system itself. The bureaucracy continued functioning efficiently according to its established procedures. Memorials arrived, committees reviewed proposals, officials debated administrative details, yet each decision increasingly relied upon categories developed under earlier circumstances. The institution responded to unfamiliar conditions using familiar administrative habits because those habits had previously reinforced successful governance. Silence itself became informative. When expected improvements failed to appear after new decrees, additional instructions often emphasized stricter implementation rather than questioning the assumptions behind the original policy. Administrative energy concentrated on enforcing existing decisions instead of investigating whether those decisions still reflected changing realities. Every reaffirmation strengthened procedural consistency while reducing institutional flexibility. Local administrators waited for revised instructions as communities adjusted daily routines around policies that everyone assumed would soon become clearer. Inside the court, this created a narrowing circle of confidence. Information confirming established expectations required little explanation. Contradictory information demanded verification, debate, and political caution. Naturally, reports consistent with accepted interpretations moved more smoothly through the administrative process than those requiring uncomfortable revisions. No single official needed to reject reality. The institution itself gradually favored information that demanded fewer disruptive consequences. This tendency reflected the incentives built into stable government rather than individual failure. Large institutions depend upon predictable procedures because constant revision can undermine authority as surely as inaction. Officials are rewarded for disciplined judgment, measured responses, and continuity. Sudden reversals suggest previous uncertainty. Frequent changes create doubts about leadership. As pressure accumulates, preserving confidence often becomes indistinguishable from preserving established interpretations of events. The result is a paradox. The more uncertainty increases outside the institution, the more valuable internal consistency appears within it. Yet the greater the commitment to consistency, the more difficult genuine adaptation becomes. Contradictory information is not rejected because it lacks evidence. It is resisted because accepting it would require authority to revise the framework through which all previous decisions had been understood. As the 19th century advanced, this narrowing process became increasingly visible. External challenges evolved more rapidly than administrative habits. Internal disturbances demanded responses that crossed provincial boundaries. Financial pressures complicated military decisions. Officials worked continuously, producing reports, recommendations, and decrees with remarkable dedication. Government remained active. Orders continued to circulate. Administration did not disappear. Instead, every new decision required greater effort to produce smaller adjustments. Provincial authorities increasingly sought clarification before acting independently, while communities learned to wait for instructions that arrived after circumstances had already begun to change. Eventually, the limitation could no longer remain entirely administrative. The issue was not whether the Qing government possessed capable officials or sophisticated institutions. It was whether those institutions could recognize contradiction quickly enough to preserve their own freedom of action. Recovery still appeared possible. Reforms remained imaginable. Authority continued issuing commands with legal force across the empire. Yet each correction required negotiating assumptions that had become more deeply embedded than the problems they were meant to solve. Confidence survived, but its ability to accommodate unwelcome information had become increasingly constrained. Perhaps this is one of history's quieter forms of pressure. Institutions rarely resist contradictory information because they seek ignorance. They resist it because authority depends upon continuity, and continuity often encourages yesterday's explanations to survive longer than today's realities. The machinery continues to operate with impressive discipline, even while the distance between decision and circumstance slowly widens. From within the institution, the movement of administration still resembles control. From outside, the narrowing range of possible responses has already begun. Authority often appears strongest just before its choices begin to narrow. If these questions continue to matter, Timeless Questions explores them every week. When authority encounters uncomfortable evidence, should preserving confidence remain its first priority? Or should preserving adaptability matter more?